Good Sunday morning, and thank you for your interest, and thank you for joining us in our virtual class, the Geneva class, as we continue to study the Gospel of John. As always, I certainly hope that you find that this study is a blessing and informative and interesting to you. That's one intent. The major purpose, of course, is that God receive the glory, and to that end, it is my prayer that nothing is said but the truth today, that all interpretations and comments are in accord with the Word of God. With that in mind, let's begin our study for today. And we are going to be looking at the effect of Jesus. Recall, John is picking out the events that take place that are going to contribute to the understanding of the people who read this gospel, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So he doesn't deal with everything, but he does consider, as he's guided, of course, by the Holy Spirit, he does consider that the effect Jesus had on people is important. And we're going to look at the effect on his brothers, his family. We're going to look at the effect he had on people living outside of the region of Jerusalem and Judea and people living within it, the effect he had upon the religious elite, the leadership, and really look at what they think about Jesus. So we look at the first 24 verses of John chapter 7. This will be part 1. Next week, we'll do part 2. One thing to keep in mind as we go through the study are these points. The timing, particularly in this first part, the first few verses, the timing for Jesus. The fact that everything that he does is in accordance with a divine agenda, a divine schedule. It's a part of that great eternal purpose of God that originated among the persons of the Trinity in the eternity before time began. And then I want us to notice also division as it begins to develop. And the context of this, the scene of this, is going to be the Feast of the Tabernacles in Jerusalem. And we will notice also his brothers, particularly in the first few verses, his brothers' unbelief and how this plays into the situation. So let's look at the first 13 verses of John chapter 7. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. And let me just pause to say that by this time, in reading through John's narrative, you are familiar with the fact that when he uses those two words after this, that can cover a good deal of territory, a good deal of time. Because again, John is picking out certain events. He's not giving us a chronology or a biography, if you please, of Christ. So after this really includes about 6 months. From the time that he delivered the Sermon on the Bread of Life, which we have looked at in the last 2 lessons. So after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now, the Jews' Feast of Booths was at hand. And I might say the Feast of Booths is the same as the Feast of Tabernacles. It commemorated the time when Israel lived in tents in the wilderness after they had left Egypt. It was one of the 4 required festivals that the Jews needed to go to Jerusalem to attend. So the Jews' Feast of Booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you're doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, he's a good man, others said, no, he's leading the people astray. Yet, for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. So let's look at the situation. John introduces it by saying, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee, would not go in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. That's a truth, that's a fact. And he's talking about the Jewish leadership, the Pharisees, the chief priests and elders, the Sanhedrin. They had him marked for death. Jesus knew that. And then John adds, the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So 6 months after the Sermon on the Bread of Life, and no secret about the intentions of the Jews to murder Jesus. And we'll just comment that the people, the crowd, multitudes, if you please, normal, ordinary people in Jerusalem and Judea were aware of it, but people living in Galilee and out away from Judea were not. That's an important point that we'll look at later. Now, what about his brothers? They're mentioned here. That's interesting. The family. His brothers said to him, leave here, go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. And then John adds a little bit parenthetically, for not even his brothers believed in him. And who were his brothers? Look, they're named elsewhere. James, who is possibly the James who was leader of the church in Jerusalem and perhaps the writer of the letter that bears the name James. And Joseph and Jude, possibly the writer of the letter that is named Jude, and Simon. So you can see that at least two, perhaps all of these brothers who at this time did not believe in Christ, came to believe in him later. Now, what is their intention in telling their brother to go to Jerusalem? Well, their intention is not entirely evil. I'm sure they love their brother. They probably wanted their now famous brother to succeed in triumph. And they are thinking that the best place to do that would be in Jerusalem during a feast such as this Feast of Tabernacles, because so many people would be there, and then he can just stand up and perform some signs and gather many more disciples. If you look carefully at what they said, leave here, go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you're doing. For no one works in secret, such as you're doing here in Galilee, if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, if you are able to do these things, and certainly the brothers believed he was, show yourself to the world. Now, they have an imperfect understanding of Jesus' mission, but it's not far from the plan. Calvin notes that they wanted him to become famous, but they despised and ridiculed him for acting unwisely and injudiciously. You want to be known by all, and yet you hide yourself. Now, I agree with Calvin that they wanted him to become famous, and they were considering that he was not doing the thing they needed to do to become famous. I think he's using too strong a term when he says they despised and ridiculed him. I just don't think they quite did that, but I wanted you to see what Calvin said anyway. Now, the emphasis that John makes on timing is significant. His time had not yet come. Jesus said to his brothers, my time has not yet come, but your time is always here. 2 times, his time and their time. Jesus' time is according to an agenda and an arrangement to which he agreed that was in place from eternity past. But human time is something that, although God providentially ordains all things, still it is up to us to make the decision what to do and when and all that. You can go if you want to, but I can't do what is not ordained for me to do. So he operated according to this divine timetable that was set in eternity past. But that timetable does not always match human times. Now, he did not thus acquiesce to his brother's request that he go with them to Jerusalem. They wanted him to perform a miracle so that people would believe in him. But John adds, they themselves were not yet believers at this point. They were not speaking from the standpoint of faith. Matthew Henry said, the reason he gives is, my time is not yet fully come. Our Lord Jesus is very exact and punctual in knowing and keeping his time, as it was a time fixed, so it was the best time. Now, Jesus goes on to say in verse 7, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. In other words, the world has a different viewpoint about me than it does you. And of course, Jesus uses the word cosmos here. That's the Greek word for world. And understand, we've talked about this before, that the word cosmos always means an orderly arrangement of something. It can be an arrangement of flowers. It can be an arrangement of appearance, hence we have our word cosmetic. It can be an arrangement of believers, or it can be an arrangement of unbelievers, but it is a group of people who have something in common. Sometimes it is used to refer to every single person. In that sense, it's an arrangement of human beings. So in this case, Jesus is using the word cosmos to refer to unbelievers, to those not yet born again, which included at this point his brothers. Jesus continued to recognize this distinction. For instance, in the great intercessory prayer of John 17, he said in verse 9, I do not pray for the world. I'm not interceding for the world. I'm not praying for the world. He's talking about, again, the arrangement of unbelievers who would, in this case, remain unbelievers. Now, his brothers, of course, do come to believe in him. So there's a time when they will leave that arrangement of unbelief to join the arrangement of believers. The world, though, remaining unbelievers, will always hate Jesus, always, because of the difference in nature. There's a difference in nature between good and evil, and that nature is reflected in this word. So Linsky says, the world, as Jesus uses the word, the world embraces all forms of opposition to Jesus. Now there's an apparent discrepancy here, and we need to talk about it. In verse 8, you go up to the feast. I'm not going up to this feast, for my time is not yet fully come. After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. How do we explain that? Jesus said, I'm not going, but he did. Some of the translations move the yet, if you'll notice verse 8 above, move the yet from the second clause, for my time is not yet fully come, to the first clause. You go up to the feast, I'm not going up to this feast yet, which suggests that he would go later. And so he told his brothers they should go to the feast. Linsky points out a different situation. He puts an emphasis, which I have indicated by underlining it, on the word this. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast. And that is the feast situation that his brothers were suggesting to him, the feast that they envisioned, that he would come at the beginning along with them and appear and do works and gain many followers. And he later went secretly to the feast, but not according to this scenario that his brothers imagined. Again, the thing under consideration here is the precise timing which Jesus followed. Now you can compare this to his mother's request at the wedding in Cana. Remember that? She pointed out to her son, they've run out of wine. And his response to her is, woman, my time has not yet come. Well, he did tell the servants, do what she tells you to do. And indeed, the result was that he changed the water into wine. In both cases, he is asked to do something, a suggestion is made that he do something, and his response is, it's not my time to do it. And in both cases, he did it. And how do we deal with that? I simply think that Jesus is pointing out, I don't respond to the direction given to me by my family or by anybody. I follow the directions that are agreed upon by my Father. And so, although he did go to the feast, although he did change the water into wine, he did not do so in direct response to the requests made to him. That's just an explanation for it. It seems reasonable, and I somewhat agree with Lenski on that. So, coming to verse 11, the Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, where is he? Understand, these Jews, as John uses that word Jews, this would be the ruling establishment, the ruling elite, the hierarchy of the Jews. They have in mind capturing him and putting him to death. And verse 12 says there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said he's a good man, others said, no, he's leading the people astray. So Jesus was aware of that fact. He was not a coward, but it was not the time for him to be arrested and put to death. He had work yet to do. So he went privately as the Jews were seeking him with intentions of murdering him. He went quietly to Jerusalem, but he was there. And he was the general subject of widespread discussion. People were muttering about him with different opinions. Calvin says they were holding private conversations about Christ, and the people were divided. You can see it here. Some of the people thought he was a good man. Others thought he was a deceiver, and neither side could convince the other. Now, this point is important from the standpoint of John, as he's guided by the Spirit. This point is important because he will mention it again 2 more times, and we'll see that in our study next week, verses 25 to 27 and verses 40 to 44. Again, the people were divided. So we'll just keep our eyes focused on that. Now, let's take this expression, he was a good man. Some people say he's a good man. I've heard people say that about others. He's a good man, in the sense that they have made a judgment that this person is all right with God. And that's rather strange in view of what the Apostle Paul says about it. There is no one good, no, not one. So Jesus, though, is interested in what people think about him, and John is interested in presenting that to us. Remember the time in Matthew 16 when Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, Jesus did not say to Peter, now, Peter, you're getting a little carried away. You know that you can't be equating me with God. That would be blasphemy. No, he said, blessed are you, Simon, son of John, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So Jesus indeed claimed to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. He claimed, in fact, to be God because he used the title I am, which is reserved for God alone. I am, that I am has sent you. He also spoke of my Father, never of our Father, putting himself in that context. And he never objected when people confessed that he was God. Thomas said, my Lord and my God. He accepted that. He claimed eternal existence with God. He said, and we're going to look at this later, before Abraham was, I am. And he often called God Abba, which is a term of endearment, a familial term, which can be translated daddy. Again, would be blasphemy from the standpoint of the religious orthodoxy of the day. And he claimed, and we looked at this in John 5:46, he claimed that the Old Testament, all that Moses said was about him, pointed to Christ, that was one of the primary witnesses to his divinity. He also claimed to forgive sin and to do other works that only God could do. So he presents the claims. Is there any doubt of the claims that Jesus made about himself? No. John Stott said his teachings reflect an egocentric character, egocentric, centering on himself. But that's not wrong if it's true. That is, if he's really God in the flesh. C.S. Lewis said, unless the speaker is God, this, and he's referring to the claim to be able to forgive sins, is really so preposterous as to be comic. And Lewis goes on to say, you must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up as a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. So he made the claim. Now, there are two possible alternatives, and only two to those claims. When he made the claims that he was God, Son of God, Messiah, able to forgive sins, etc., he either knew that these claims were false, or he did not know that these claims were false. So let's take the first situation. Suppose he makes these claims, no doubt that he made the claims, and that he knew that they were false, in which case he would be a liar. He would be making a deliberate misrepresentation. He certainly would be a hypocrite, as he claimed to be something he was not. He was playing a role. And it was demonic to do that, because look at the people who believed in him and who suffered and who died subsequently, not only in his generation, but to this day and to the point that Christ comes again. Thousands and thousands of people, maybe millions of people who have died because of believing in Christ, if it is nothing but a lie. And he would be a fool to do it because he himself died for it. But let's look at the second alternative. Suppose he makes the claims, but he really didn't know that the claims were false, in which case he would be sincerely deluded. He would be a lunatic. He'd be crazy. So let's ask the question, was he a liar? Was he a deceiver? Well, first of all, he made the claim to be God in the midst of radical monotheism. The Jewish society was the first to make a strong and definite claim that there was but one God. Exception to a situation in Egypt to some degree. There was a king of Egypt who earlier had said that there was one God. His name was Akhenaten, and the god was Aten. But really it wasn't true monotheism, because Akhenaten claimed he himself was a god, so that makes two gods. So let's just say the Jews were the first to advance this claim that there is only one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. So he's going to claim to be God in the midst of that environment. Now, if he'd done this in Rome, no problem. They believe in many gods. If he'd done this in Athens, no problem. They believe in many gods. But in Jerusalem, now he would have to be the best deceiver ever in terms of cleverness to get by with that, as far as he did, to be able to convince so many people that he did convince, including the 12, plus all of the crowds that followed him. He'd have to be the best deceiver in history to get by with it, but he would also have to be the worst in terms of morality, because it is blasphemy to claim to be God, a violation of the first commandment. And also, as I mentioned before, it would be immoral in the greatest degree to be the cause of death and suffering for so many of his followers. So let's look at the second possibility, that he knew that he made the claims, but he really didn't know that those claims were false because he was crazy. He was suffering from a severe case of malignant narcissistic megalomania. Now, that is a mental illness. It is a situation that people through the years have had, continue to have, and today they would need mental treatment. But in those days, they simply dismissed such mental problems as being demon possessed. But he doesn't give the signs of a narcissist or a megalomaniac. His words and his actions suggest a calm self-possession and quiet authority. There is nothing in his behavior that would suggest that, and there is nothing in the reaction of people that would suggest that they believed he was crazy. They wouldn't take him seriously, even to the point of opposing him as well as following him. That is an indication they took his claims seriously. So if he was not a liar and if he was not crazy, there's only one choice left, and that is that he would be Lord. He would be God incarnate. Josh McDowell, who wrote the book Evidences That Demand a Verdict, wrote these words: "Whom you decide Jesus Christ is must not be an intellectual exercise. You cannot put him on the shelf as a great moral teacher, namely a good man." Remember the crowd, some of the crowd thought he was a good man. You can't be a good man and be either a liar or crazy. That's not a valid option. He is either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. You must make a choice. But as the Apostle John wrote, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." The claims of Jesus present a choice, a necessary choice, really, because of the seriousness of those claims, that every person should examine what Jesus said and decide. Now, one other thing that John puts in this that's so important, remember, John never puts anything extraneous into his account. He says, even though there's muttering among the crowds and they're saying different things about him, yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. Remember, his brothers said, you need to go openly and teach. But in Jerusalem, the situation was people do not speak openly one way or the other of Christ. James Montgomery Boyce made this comment: all this discussion was not in the open for fear of the Jews, indicating their spiritual slavery. Yes, they talked about him, but they talked about him quietly. They whispered about him, not openly, because the Jews had made an announcement. No one is to say anything about this man openly. Spiritual slavery. They have no freedom of speech. Their ability to speak and to make any statements at all are curtailed, are censored. Calvin said, they, meaning the Jews, burned with such hatred against Christ that they did not allow a single word on either side. They saw it best if his name could be buried in oblivion. And further, and this is a very interesting comment from Calvin, when all liberty is kept suppressed by fear so that no one dares utter a word, it is the most wretched condition. So let's move to the second part of our study for today, where we'll see the escalation of conflict with the Jews and further division among the people. And the context of this is going to be the questioning of Jesus' right to teach. And there'll be a continuing controversy over what he did in Jerusalem the last time he was in Jerusalem, namely when he healed the crippled man at the pool of Bethesda. So we'll look at verses 14 to 24. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" So Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? And yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. And before we leave this slide, please notice there are many things in here that we often discuss separately, individually, out of the context. Nothing particularly wrong with that, but to look at it within the context is significant because it's all flowing together and all connected to the fact that the Jews are questioning the credentials of Jesus to teach. So about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. Now, up to this point, he's gone to Jerusalem, but he's remained rather quiet, out of sight. He's kept a low profile, we might say, and the Jews don't know he's there. They had been planning to arrest him and put him to death. And maybe now, at the middle of the feast, they have reached the conclusion he didn't come. And so he caught them off guard. But he goes into the temple and he begins to teach. That means he would sit cross-legged on the floor. He would gather around him a group of people. They would become his class, if you please, his students, and he would begin to teach. This is the first time he's done that. Earlier visits to Jerusalem, he did not. So he has the audacity now to come into the temple and to assume the position of a rabbi. And the timing, and here his brothers might see the point, and the timing is excellent because at the middle of the feast, you'd have the most people there, and he would reach a number of people. But of course, not just the people, but he obviously attracted the attention of the Pharisees. Now, John does not record what he taught, not as he did when he recorded the Sermon on the Bread of Life that we looked at previous weeks. But the significance at this point is the fact that he's teaching and his authority to teach, his credentials to teach. So that's what these Jews are concerned about. That's what the religious leadership is concerned about. The Jews therefore marveled, and that doesn't mean a favorable sense of marveling, wondering. They're astonished, but they are very distressed at the same time. So the Jews therefore marvel, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? Now you have to see that they are directing their words not to each other. They're talking to the crowd. They're talking to Jesus' students. Get the picture. Jesus sitting there, his students forming a class, sitting around him, listening to him, and up come these leaders, Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, whatever, and they interrupt Jesus and say this to the students. How can you be studying from this man? He's never studied himself. He doesn't have a degree. He has learning, we admit that, but he doesn't have credentials. They recognize he's a very well-educated, well-informed man, but where did he get his knowledge? And to be able to teach in the temple would require that. And this is the first time that Jesus has taught as a rabbi in the temple courts. They were surprised that a person would teach without rabbinical instruction. Remember how Paul was a student of Gamaliel. He had proper rabbinical instruction. So the question, as I said, was addressed to the crowd with the idea of discrediting Jesus, charging Jesus with incompetence because he lacks the proper qualifications. He has no degree from a rabbinical school. He's not studied under a famous rabbi. So they direct the attention of Jesus' students to the fact that he has not attended a great or accredited school. And so Jesus' following responses are in reference to that charge that he doesn't have the academic credentials. My teaching, he said, is not mine, but his who sent me. I am not making these things up. I am teaching as I have been taught by God. Now, Jesus probably is not addressing these comments not so much to the Jews who are standing around, but to his class, to the people who are listening to him, to his students. And they could sense the difference. Obviously, they had no doubt been in the temple before and studied under other rabbis. They could sense the difference between the way Jesus taught and the way these rabbis taught. He is claiming his knowledge was not his at all, but that it came from God. And they knew there was a difference in what he was saying. And Jesus was referring to a source higher and better than any rabbinical school, the highest source of all, Almighty God. Dr. Boyce observed, there is an enormous gulf between human traditions and the revelation of God, between man's doctrine and God's doctrine, a difference they would sense. And we think in this sense about Isaiah 55, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And then in that same context, as he is flowing along with this thought of the authority he had to teach, he said, if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. Jesus does not submit his teaching to decisions of human reason and authority. He does not allow men to qualify him, give him the authority to teach. Understanding the source of Jesus' authority and teaching, he says, depends not on a degree that he would receive from a rabbinical school or to the approbation of some great rabbi, but the source of Jesus' authority and teaching depends on the determination of a person to do the will of God. An individual can decide that, he can know that if he wants to do God's will. So that brings up the question, what causes a person to want to do God's will? And I think again of Jonathan Edwards in his book on the freedom of the will, saying will means choice. And something has to inform our choice. There have to be influences to shape our choice. They don't just come out of thin air. So here's a person who had no interest in doing God's will. He is dead in trespasses and sins. And what then would cause that individual to then want to do God's will? Not he himself. It is an action from God. And of course, that would be the new birth. What Jesus told Nicodemus, you can see, you can understand the kingdom, you can enter the kingdom only by the new birth. And in the new birth, our being, our essence, our character, our nature is changed. Linsky puts it this way. When Jesus speaks of our willing to do God's will, he means that willing which God, by his grace, works in us through his word and his spirit. God is the prime mover. He is the one who changes our orientation so that we would want to do God's will. Now, is there an importance and a need for an individual thus who is born again to make up his mind that he really wants to do God's will and to dedicate himself to that? Of course. But the means of determining the truthfulness of Jesus' teaching is one's own experience with the doctrine of Christ as a result of faith. So we're born again, we come to faith, We begin to live in accordance with God's will. We begin to live the Christian life. We have an experience with it. We can now recognize the truth. And Boyce says, if a man determines in advance that he will live by it, that is God's will, that he is serious with God, then God will disclose the truths of his word to him. Thus, the way any person can identify and know the truth. Here are a couple of comments by Matthew Henry and Linsky. Henry says, the most competent judges of the truth and divine authority of Christ's doctrine are those that with a sincere and upright heart desire and endeavor to do the will of God. If any man be willing to do the will of God, have his will melted into the will of God, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself. Linsky says, to know means to realize, not by reasonings and arguments, but by the actual experience of letting God's will move his will. When God's will sets the human will free and fills it with a new power, then and then alone, a man knows God's will and what it really is by having experienced in his own will what God's will does. Now, Jesus is continuing. Same context, same subject, that is his authority to teach. And he says, the one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. And no doubt his students would think about rabbis they had heard earlier, who obviously were on an ego trip. They were seeking their own glory by showing the class how much they knew. And he says, that's not the case with me. I seek the glory of him who sent me. When a teacher presents anything emanating from himself, he is seeking his own glory, and all glory belongs to God. Jesus says he seeks not his own glory, but God's glory, thus proving that he speaks truth. Those who would seek the praise of the rabbis show their hypocrisy and set a false test for religious leaders. Yes, that's indeed the case. The test that these authorities have in mind, the elite, the Sanhedrin members who are there interrupting Jesus' class, the test they have in mind is the approval of some rabbinical school being accredited by some great rabbi. But the real test is whether one seeks his own glory or the glory of God. And then Jesus said, has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Now let's go back to what I said earlier. The people living in Judea, and particularly in Jerusalem, were well aware of the plots of the Jews. But the crowds coming from beyond Jerusalem, such as in Galilee, could not believe the Jews intended to murder Jesus and thought Jesus, must be demonically influenced. Henry said, the multitude of the people that came up out of the country to the feast did not suspect that there was any design on foot against him. And therefore they said, who goes about to kill thee? But those of Jerusalem knew the plot and irritated their rulers to put it into execution. Is not this he whom they seek to kill? Why do they not do it then? Who hinders them? So obviously from these disparate comments of the crowd, one comment, who's trying to kill you? No one's trying to kill you. And another comment from another part of the crowd saying, this is the one they're trying to kill, certainly would confirm the fact that people outside of Jerusalem, outside of Judea, did not know that, but people living in Jerusalem and Judea did know it. And Calvin comments, it was a common phrase among the Jews who'd been brought up to believe that when men are impelled by rage or have lost their minds and reason, that they are disturbed by the devil. And then Jesus reminded them of something that they were thinking about, that they had not forgotten about. That is what happened the last time he was in Jerusalem when he healed the man who had been crippled for 38 years at the pool of Bethesda and told him to pick up his bed and walk. Jesus answered them, I did one work. Of course, he did many works, but he's reminding them of the one work that's on their mind that they saw that they couldn't forget about. I did one work and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision. Not that it's from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me? Because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well. It's interesting. Again, Jesus is trying to make people think. He says Moses gave the law. Actually, the law of circumcision preceded the actual law of Moses, but Moses gave the law. No one's kept it. And the law at this point cannot save, it can only condemn. But the hypocrisy of the people is evident not only in the fact that they don't keep the law, but in the fact that they remembered that Jesus had performed a miracle on the Sabbath. All they could think about was Sabbath law has been broken when he told the man to pick up his bed and walk. Yet they circumcised on the Sabbath. Was that wrong? No, actually the law did require it. The baby boy is circumcised on the 8th day, regardless of whether it falls on the Sabbath or not. And also, doing good was permitted on the Sabbath. Doing work was not, but doing good was permitted. And Jesus healed, which was a good work. Of course, what really irritated them was the fact that he told the man to pick up his bed and walk, which he did. But Jesus is trying to get these people to think, which is the greater blessing? I made a man's whole body well, which would include spiritual healing. Now, he is referring to healing the crippled man on the Sabbath. And Linsky says healing a man's whole body well would point to the partial blessing of circumcision as against the complete healing of the man's whole body. Now, what is he talking about here? Well, all of the commentators whom I consulted pointed out that there is a blessing to circumcision, although, of course, in circumcision, as Dr. Boyce points out, there was a mutilation involved that required a subsequent physical healing, and there was pain involved in it. But it was a blessing in that it was a sacrament. It indicated that the child was now under the covenant of Moses. And one scholar pointed out that it was a blessing on future procreation. But with this man, 38 years a cripple, and the fact, Jesus alluded to the fact that he was a cripple because of something he had done wrong when he was young, when he said, do not sin anymore, lest a worse thing come upon you. So what Jesus did is to heal his body and his soul. And Jesus is saying, isn't that a better blessing than the blessing of circumcision? Let's look at what Calvin said. Circumcision and the healing of the paralytic were similar in that each was a divine work, but Christ maintains that the latter is more excellent since its benefit extends to the whole man, physical and spiritual. Christ is therefore connecting the spiritual result of the miracle to the outward benefit granted to the body. And so he rightly prefers the entire healing of a man to circumcision. And again, because he has the opportunity to point out the sin which resulted in the man's disability and admonish him now to live free of that sin. And finally, and still, this is the same context, the same subject of flowing out of Jesus' authority to teach. Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. In other words, when you make a judgment, make sure it's right. Make sure it's reasonable. Now, he's not talking about sitting in judgment on another person, and this is not a contradiction to Jesus' earlier statement, judge not that you be not judged. I've had people say, but you look at this passage. This means we can judge. This is not talking about judging people. This is talking about deciding on what can be done and not done on the Sabbath, for instance. This is talking about understanding the difference between healing a whole man spiritually and physically and the benefit of circumcision. God's law, God's work, God's doctrine. People have to decide what is right. And the point is they need to make that decision based on truth. And they need to think it through in a reasonable way. Calvin said, judgment will never be right unless it is formed from the truth of reality. And this is a very good point that Calvin makes. For as soon as personality comes into it, eyes and senses are focused on that, and the truth immediately disappears. He goes on to say, Christ therefore replies that right judgment flows from the fear and reverence of God, so that if our minds are disposed to the fear of God, they will easily see whether what he preaches is true or not. And so we come to the end of our study. And next week, we will be looking at the continuation of what happened there at the Feast of the Tabernacles, at the effect of Jesus. And we'll see that confusion continues and division continues. Thank you for being a part of our study today. I do hope that this has been a blessing for you, and I do hope you have a blessed week and we enter into Holy Week, that it is a glorious time to celebrate the resurrection of our Lord. So may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you, lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.